we're day 3 of the first moon mission, which this time is about the challenge to take on a plant-based diet, which is a phrase that I've been using instead of veganism. And one of the things that really needs to be explored is what the difference is and why I chose one, not the other, and how people use those ideas. But I wanted to get a little bit more exploratory this time around and talk a little bit about the philosophy of food, because there's few things that get people as riled up as other people's diets. And by that I don't mean diets with names, I mean essentially what people eat, what they put in their mouths and ingest. People get really angry. The favourite at the moment is low fat versus low carb. I've tried both of those things and it's clear to me that they both work. One of the reasons that they both work to one extent or another is that the moment you start thinking about what you're eating, your habits change. And when you don't think about it, that's when you start to eat things that perhaps are less than conducive to good health. Humans are the only creatures really that bother to think about it at all. One of the things that's clear from the history of myths, and to a certain extent religion, is that despite the great gift of consciousness, being able to think about things, being able to envision and fantasize and explore possible futures, besides these great gifts, that's kind of a curse in itself. We're the only creatures that can think about that stuff. We're the only ones really that can understand the idea of our own deaths when we're not in immediate danger. And we're the only ones that really can think about what we eat. From this great awakening that we had, one of the first things we seem to have experienced is guilt. And one of the main ways that we've dealt with guilt, from this waking up to what we're actually doing, is we ritualize it. And we use rituals and myths to kind of make excuses for the way things are. So a simple example is, in our society, we can pretty much do anything that we want to animals. Because like it or not, the Judeo-Christian myth of man having dominion over the animals is still lodged firmly in our consciousness. It's still completely in our brains, or at least many of us. So we get this natural dominance in our heads. We see ourselves as the centre of the universe, and it's not limited to Jews and Christians. It's limited to anyone that thinks based on those ways. That includes humanism. People that anyone that considers humans to be somehow better or more important, to have more so-called rights than any other creature, they're all basing it on the same flawed kind of thinking. And that's where some of our eating habits come from. So in early periods, in early myths, people killed animals and ate them, and they dealt with the guilt of that. They were conscious of what they were doing, and they saw that life was brutal, that it was nasty, that it was painful, that it was hard. And they created these rituals to make it okay. The trouble is now is that society and culture and thinking is starting to, not just starting, but maybe the acceleration is starting to happen. People are thinking beyond culture. They're racing faster than culture can keep up. And we start to think that we're somehow better again. And humanism reasserts itself so that people that claim to be more awake to the pain that's around us will choose things like different diets. And that's really the root of veganism. To some extent the root of plant-based diets, but certainly the philosophical and political and social side of veganism is rooted in this idea that as humans have evolved a consciousness and we should use it. That just because something is possible, just because something is the so-called natural order of things, doesn't mean to say that we have to blindly follow it. I think there's probably arguments both ways there to say that that's to a greater or lesser extent right or wrong. So because food and our consciousnesses are so firmly and intrinsically linked, that's why we get such radical responses from people when it comes to diet. It's one of the reasons that vegans are so evangelizing, sometimes angry, sometimes aggressive, sometimes pious. There's a reputation there for almost religious zeal. But talk to any meat eater or anyone with a standard diet, and they're just as vociferous, they're just as angry sometimes in their claims about what human beings need to function, that somehow we need meat, that we're supposed to eat meat, that our teeth prove it, we've got canines, and therefore the science just isn't in on that. Anyone that tries to claim that the science tells us that we are meat eaters or not is lying mad, or at the very least misunderstanding what's being said. We don't know what we're supposed to do. We know that people can live very long and healthy lives on meat, and we know that they live very long and healthy lives without meat. It depends on far too many factors. So vegans have sometimes a political purpose. Sometimes they're trying to change the consciousnesses of other people. Sometimes it's under the umbrella of compassion. People talk about compassion as a prime driver for vegetarianism. Well, first of all, anyone that's ever seen what happens to the cows that produce the milk and the chickens that produce the eggs knows that vegetarianism isn't based on compassion. It may be based on fashion, it may be based on health, it may be based on all manner of things that are important, and there's not to take anything away from the reasons that people are vegetarian, and many more besides. But it isn't about compassion if they really stop and think about it. Whereas vegans maybe have a bit more of a claim. Vegans would say, well, we don't support the farming industry in any way whatsoever. Sometimes they don't even eat, often they don't even eat honey. It's debatable as to whether bees are kept in captivity. But I guess that's another question. Ultimately, the philosophy of food is this: humans are the only creatures that get to make those kinds of choices. And even then, not every human. Because if you're starving and all you're being offered is something that you wouldn't normally choose to eat, you will take it. The growth in veganism and vegetarianism isn't a sign of a more compassionate society. It might be based on some more compassionate individuals, but it's not really about society changing in any compassionate sense. It's about society getting richer, more comfortable. The more comfortable we are, the more choices that we've got. Choice is the greatest gift that society, one of the greatest gifts that society bestows on us. And one of those big choices is what we choose to eat. Not everyone in the world has that. Not everyone can make those decisions. So any dietary choice is based on privilege. It's based on root ideas about what's right and wrong. It's based on health, though no one can really tell you for sure what's the right choice and what's the wrong choice. So ultimately, the philosophy of food can only ever be personal. It can only ever come from your genetics, from your inherited traits and behaviours, from your experiences, and from your thinking. So one of the reasons for me to do this isn't to challenge myself to eat a certain way. That's not a challenge. People do challenges all the time that are difficult. This isn't difficult, it's inconvenient, and sometimes it's unpleasant for someone that is used to a certain kind of diet to have to make different choices. There may even be an addiction dimension to things like cheese. But no, this challenge is an intellectual one. to experience what it's like to make some decisions like this and to think about why people do. So that in now 26.5 days, when this moon mission comes to an end, there'll be no great congratulations or any kind of sense of achievement from following this certain kind of diet. This is just a privilege to be able to do this. What there will be is hopefully a renewed understanding of why people make the choices that they make, what some of the consequences of those choices can be, and how we can support each other more in the making of those choices. See you tomorrow.